Okay, so I've officially shifted into Dune mode this weekend. I rewatched the first on my 4K Blu-ray, and then I went to see part 2 yesterday afternoon, and I gotta say it was pretty freaking good. I do think the hype behind the film has definitely overblown the reactions. The reviews have been a little overzealous in general in my opinion, but I also think the reactions in the opposite direction have been a little ridiculous too. A lot of the negativity towards this film have been from the book purists who disagree with a lot of the fundamental changes Villeneuve has made from the original text. And though I have not read the source material, well, I've tried twice, but I've never reached the end, it's always been my belief that books, comics, TV shows, short stories, and apparently even Twitter threads are a different medium, so adapting them means translating them to a new medium, and oftentimes, most times, that means changing them. Now, how much you change and with what liberty varies from project to project, but as long as the change works, I don't see the harm. Take for instance the Guardians of the Galaxy, or even a better example would be the Lord of the Rings films, especially the Two Towers, which deviates quite a lot from the original story, or at least how it's told, and they add in a lot that wasn't there originally. And the reason it works is that Tolkien books are notably difficult to adapt. The writing just doesn't translate to a visual medium such as film, and different mediums have different audiences that engage with it differently, and they have different goals with pacing and other things. And Dune Part 1 and 2 are both adaptations of the same novel, Dune by Frank Herbert, which is also notably a difficult text to adapt. Villeneuve's first attempt is generally considered pretty faithful, but this one the complaint has largely been how much was changed, but also from what I hear, this section of the book just doesn't work in the film form, and these changes have made for a more engaging and cinematic experience. A lot of the changes from what I've seen have been to service Paul's arc into near villainy, which makes sense because even Herbert has admitted that when writing Dune Messiah, he had to really drive home Paul's morally grey characteristics since people were seeing him as too much of a hero by the end of the first novel. So I'm completely okay with all of these changes, as I think it's made a lot of things work very well cinematically. And cinematic is a word I use specifically here because that's exactly how I would describe Denis Villeneuve as a filmmaker. Especially in this film, he has such an immaculate sense of scale. Even one-to-one hand-to-hand combat scenes have this grandiose feel and look to them. They truly feel akin to the lightsaber fights in the original Star Wars trilogy, or even the Kurosawa samurai fights that inspired them, which speaks partially to the fight choreography, which itself is a great vehicle for telling the story. A good fight should examine the characters in them, and then demonstrate their differences and their place in this conflict with each move. And in this movie, I love how every faction or army approach combat differently. Even individual warriors and characters have their own feel and style. This is what makes the blank canvases of this film's locations so effective. The cinematography is beautiful and makes for a good vessel for bodily storytelling, but we already know the film is going to be gorgeous. Villeneuve is one of the most striking and competent directors visually that's currently working. And though the locations are mostly vacant settings of sand and brutalist architecture, they perfectly invoke the emotions of the scenes, and they pull the utmost out of every moment to make it feel fresh even when it isn't. Both Villeneuve and cinematographer Greg Fraser have crafted a spectacle that visually adapts what people previously thought was unadaptable. We even travel to entirely different locations, like these black and white scenes that I've seen mixed responses on, but I think it looks very clean, which is a great contrast to the sandy and dirty dunes of Arrakis. Gedi Prime is very industrialist, and that combined with the colour palette serves to differentiate there from everywhere else, and how figuratively black and white the entire place is. Plus, it makes Arrakis seem so vibrant and full of life despite what you may think of when you think of a desert planet. And though Denis himself has cited things such as Lawrence of Arabia and Persona as influences, I think an undeniable influence on the aesthetic as a whole is Ridley Scott. Of course, Villeneuve made the sequel to Scott's Blade Runner with 2017's Blade Runner 2049, so his appreciation for Scott is already noted, but Dune Part 2 takes massive influence from other Ridley Scott classics like Alien, Prometheus and Gladiator, which I suppose comes full circle because Scott had famously attempted to work on a Dune adaptation which eventually led to the Lynch version in '84. But Villeneuve handles these influences well and knows where to draw the line between homage and copying. It's the same with the Lawrence of Arabia and Persona stuff. His influences even spread to the writing. He notes Akira being a big influence on Paul's arc, which at first seems surprising but then makes more sense the more you think about it. And The Last Temptation of Christ, which is an inevitability when making movies about reluctant messiahs. But just like that movie, this movie handles the theme of faith and the unstoppable power of it. It moves like a tornado, unable to pause, and grips everything within reach. There's threads about the dangers of false prophets, the dangers of real prophets, and what being a prophet even means. For example, Stilgar wants Paul to be their leader because of this prophecy. Gurney wants Paul to be their leader because he wants him to gain power, but either way it's the same end, and with Paul being such a morally great character, that makes for very interesting material. It explores how very easy it is to fall from freedom fighter just trying to liberate a people that liberated you to war general, and then it's a very slippery slope to oppressor and warmonger, emperor even. But also on this road to where Paul ends up, I love how he goes on this hero's journey despite not ending up a hero overall. He's doing these Herculean trials to confirm who he is in other people's eyes, not even his own. I got goosebumps when he rode the grandfather worm and was accepted by the Fremen as they cheered him on, but whilst on this journey you never lose sight of the overarching narrative, and the script perfectly balances Paul's personal journey with the movement of the story at large, and you feel the weight and tension of this war that's being waged. The big final battle is a true definition of epic. It's a grand scale conflict that never loses an inch of perspective, and I think what aids that is the writing of every single character in this conflict. Paul and Chani have the focus, of course, and they're developed really well, especially in their final moments compared to their first. It's a true representation of how far they've come in their personal journeys and together. But their chemistry is stale to say the least. I truly think the film is at its weakest when they're trying to make the audience invest in their romance. Honestly, Paul and Stilgar have better chemistry than the main romantic couple. Stilgar is so down horrendous for this quirks of white boy, and it's great how we follow him going from a leader to a believer. But what's interesting about him and all of the Fremen are their tendencies to disagree. They all have differing opinions, which is notable because it shows us they aren't this huge united force they're being perpetuated as by the opposing side. There's a lot of controversy within their peoples, and the two pillars that represent that the most are Stilgar and Chani, who both are loyal to Paul for opposing reasons. Javier Bardem honestly feels like comedic relief, which may not have been intentional, but he is hilarious every time he sims himself a Paul. Skarsgård is again incredibly terrifying and fills the screen with his presence and still performance. Dave Bautista is a big shouty man and does it perfectly. Rebecca Ferguson steals every single frame she's present in. Austin Butler has not yet fully removed the Elvis out of his voice, and though at first I thought Chalamet was miscast as Paul Atreides, he sold me by the latter half of this movie. Honestly, that final 1v1 was built so well. The opposing forces of a cold psychopath who seems to get horny over irrationality and danger, and an emotional but driven young man with a messiah complex is the most engaging these movies have ever been. There's no music, just the built-up emotions of a couple hours and two great performances. I even love how by the end they kind of demonstrate how Paul is not that much different from Harkonnen, making the Emperor kiss his ring, which parallels Fade making Beast kiss his boot in an earlier scene, both interactions offering the alternative of death. It's honestly so impressive how every character has a definable arc, even down to the most minor characters, and it cannot be understated how difficult that is to manage. The script juggled so many moving parts constantly. It's a miracle the plates don't fall, but they just keep on spinning. And does that make this movie the masterpiece it's currently being credited as? Well, in my opinion, no. Do I think it's better than the first film? Well, not really. Know that this film is called Dune Part 2. It's a companion piece. It's not really a separate movie. I think this and the first movie are completely on par as they work together as a unit rather than separate vehicles. Even the arcs stretch over from 1 to 2. People have been comparing this to Empire Strikes Back, Avatar: The Way of Water, Spider-Man 2 and The Dark Knight and things of the like, which I think are impossible comparisons because A, I think we're losing our minds a little bit here, and B, the difference between this and those others is that they can be viewed as soul experiences. You can sit down and just watch The Dark Knight if you wanted to. You can sit down and watch Spider-Man 2, Empire Strikes Back, Avatar: The Way of Water all by themselves without having to rewatch the first, because although the narrative is an extension of the first, they're completely separate experiences with their own individual arcs, whereas you simply won't find many people in any amount of time from now thinking, I think I'll watch Dune Part 2 today. It will always be attached to the first, they will almost always be viewed together, which isn't this film's fault, that's exactly what they're going for. After all, it's an adaptation of this second half of the same book. It's the same story. I think people just have this itching feeling that they have to compare every decent sequel to the best ones ever made, and to me, this isn't one of the best sequels ever made. It's a great movie with some layered themes and brilliant technique behind it. But that's just me. Have you seen Dune Part 2? If so, let me know what you think about it. If not, will you? And whether it's a second part of a two-part movie experience or not. As always, keep watching movies.